Good evening. Good day. We're sitting on Siegfried Wagener's property, which was given to my grandmother, who I found all of Siegfried's radio shows in her garage. So we're going to read Siegfried Wagener's analysis of propaganda that was dated Friday, March 13th and read at 7:15 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Mountain West Time. Good evening. While the vital decisions in this war are more than ever in the balance, and dark events loom on all horizons, the shortwave voices of the world have grown deep with anxiety. This expresses itself largely in the most intense wishful thinking which I have observed in shortwave propaganda since it all started in 1939. The most blatant case in point are the recent statements made by the Japanese Premier Tojo and his chief of military publicity. It took a lot not to laugh out loud when the Japanese radio broadcasted these to the listening world. In fact, as a propaganda analyst, I did laugh with grim satisfaction when I heard their ridiculous claims that Great Britain and the United States are already defeated. I heard something like that before when the last fall Hitler claimed he had annihilated the Red Army and that the Soviet Russia is no longer in existence. It was Hitler's darkest moment because at exactly that time the Russians began their powerful counteroffensive which turned the tide in Russia and made Hitler the laughingstock at home and abroad. So when the Japs came out with the same type of propaganda for home consumption and embellished it with the promise of Jap Navy parade in the harbor of New York at a time when Hitler would hoist the swastika on the Tower of London, they were merely begging the question whether, too, they have reached the point where Hitler was forced to make a completely unjustified claim in order to keep his people and even his generals in line. You can see propaganda analysis is not permitted to pass up the Jap claim of already won victory as being too silly to demand serious consideration. Nothing is too silly in this war of propaganda. Everything has a reason. That is a hard-headed truth, and to abide by it takes hard-headed labor, stripped off of all sentimentality and emotion. A propaganda analyst cannot just laugh or get mad when he listens to the enemy propaganda. He can laugh only when he has uncovered the possible cause for the enemy's outrageous statements, which in case of the Japs indicate that they have reached military, economically, and in point of morale the same impasse which Hitler reached last fall. He too had won on all battlefields. He too had extended his lines of communication to their uttermost limits. And he too had to give reassurance to his people for whom the war had already lasted much too long. So Premier Tojo's wish dream revealed rather than covered up the true position of Japan, and at precisely this moment, quite similar to what happened in Russia, American and Australian bombers and Navy units roar into action and take the offensive away from the Japs. Well, this is the spoiling of all the fun they were having at the propaganda ministries in Tokyo, Rome, and Berlin. Somebody stepped out on a well-protected bag of propaganda and forced the cat out of it with some of the weirdest howling anyone has ever heard in the night of May. The gentleman who did that was Sir Stafford Cripes, and that occasion was when he boarded the plane for India with a secret plan for India's independence in his briefcase. While he had not even left England, the Axis shortwave in Berlin and Rome began to blast away with a fury which only betrayed their deep anxiety about his mission. Said Rome Radio, I quote, "The Britain's promise of independence for India means only that they will try to get all they can from India. What the hundreds of millions of Indians themselves think about doesn't count at all. Let India fight for Great Britain. That is British patriotism," unquote. Berlin talked the same blue streak, but Berlin and Rome seemed to be much more infuriated than Tokyo. This could possibly be taken as an indication that European end of the Axis will be losing much more than Japan should Sir Stafford succeed in winning the people of India for the case of the United Nations. The United Nations. Whatever Hitler's strategic losses in that case may be, he would certainly lose one for the most concentrated and expensive propaganda efforts. Whatever Hitler's strategic losses in that case may be, he would certainly lose one of his most concentrated and expensive propaganda efforts, which was India. For many years, he has entertained in Berlin a large group of Indian nationals who worked out of his propaganda for India. One of them is the former leader of the Indian National Congress, Subhas Chandra Bose, who fled to the Axis territory in 1941. At the Mutual KFEL's listening post, I have often listened in on the sumptuous bouquets and parties which Hitler threw for all these people, and which Dr. Goebbels never failed to put on the air. The efforts of Mussolini in this respect were merely small want ads besides Hitler's full-page advertising, which is based on the stale cag that the Nazis and Hindus are both Aryans, and thus close kin since the dawn of man in Europe. There is an entire Nazi literature written on that subject, which at least some of Germans believe, whose eternal frustration makes them yearn back to the alleged cradle of the human race in Central Asia. Yeah, an Arlington man from Santa Barbara was 11,000 BC. A little older than the alleged cradle over there. These Nazi mystics figure that if the Thule Society, Hollow Earth, these Nazi mystics figure that if they can only prove their direct relation to that ancestral ape, which once fell out of a tree and began walking upright on the high plateau of Tibet, they would have an India in the bag, kit and caboodle. So Hitler's idea was to go tell, hey, India, you guys are all Aryans. Let's be Aryans together. Let's fight the British. And we'll burn all the ones that are less thans. This hopping around on all fours to prove their kinship with the Indian people may be the reason why Jap propaganda did not have much of a chance to horn in on the Nazis' propaganda game. For India, Hitler may have been able to tell some of the German nitwits that the Japs were the Aryans of the Far East. Oh yeah, Japan is the honorary Aryans according to Hitler. But Japs could hardly go to the people of India who knew them too well and say, we are Aryans and we must stick together. Not even the untouchable would ever make the mistake of regarding a Jap as a long-lost uncle. And so I've recently pointed out that Jap propaganda had to fall back on the argument that the Japanese and Indians are both colored people and thus united in opposing the white race. But Hitler would throw fits all over Europe and Asia if the Japs should flaunt this too much in his face, contradicting what his hired Indian quislings were telling the people of India. In his efforts to divide and rule, Nazi and Jap propaganda thus arrived at their cross purposes, and it has been so far the Jap who piped down to let the other spear do the barking. But with Sir Stafford Cripes in India, all the money Hitler has spent on India may well go down the drainpipe. And because he and his propaganda experts, including the fellow in Rome who is twiddling his thumbs when he is not chewing them, are afraid of this, they are raising Cain all over the shortwave ether. They're trying to save what there is to be saved of their long-hatched wish dream. They are trying to shout down the same reasoning among the Indian people, and in doing so, they follow Hitler's personal advice when he once told his followers, I quote, "The greatest of intellects can be liquidated if its owner is beaten to death with a steel-filled rubber hose." What? Hitler's personal advice when he once told his followers, I quote, "The greatest of intellects can be liquidated if its owner is beaten to death with a steel-filled rubber hose," unquote. Meanwhile, the Russian radio continued counting the loot of the Red Army and telling the interminable stories about the partisans, guerrilla fighting behind the German lines. By listening to these stories, I have sometimes been able to under the impression that for the present Russia guerrilla fighters are the only ones who carry on the battle against the Nazis. It may be the intention of Russian propaganda in this way to stir the rest of the United Nations into effective guerrilla action whenever the enemy is penetrated, like Wolverines. But there are a number of occasions where the guerrilla stories appear to be smokescreen behind which is hidden either a temporary stalemate or that vast spring offensive which the Red Army and not Hitler seems to be starting if the reported indications are correct. This brings me to our own wish thinking, of which we do have a lot of these days, some of which finds its way into our own shortwave propaganda to which I often listen. But there is this difference between our wish thinking and that of other nations, including our allies. We are only starting in this war while all others, even Russia, have already a long, exhausting fight behind themselves. Our enemies have all been at war for 2.5 to 5 years. In the last war, we came in when everybody else was pretty near down and out. Thus, we could carry the Allied cause to victory. That's World War I. Today, the same is happening, World War II. And now we're at World War III. We are fresh. None of our fighters and war production workers knows what war fatigue and starvation mean. Nobody among us expects to do less, but more in the days to come. And if we do what we are expected to do, and if we have promised our allies and threatened to our enemies, then it seemed to me that we are one nation which is in a fair way of making its wish thinking come true, no matter what the odds are at this moment or how deep our own anxiety is. In the last war, we came in when everybody else was pretty near down and out. Thus, we could carry the Allied cause to victory. Today, the same is happening again. We are fresh. None of our fighters and war production workers knows war fatigue and starvation mean. Nobody among us expects to do less, but more in the days to come. And if we do what we expect to do, and what we have promised our allies and threatened to our enemies, then it would seem to me that we are one nation which in a fair way of making its wish thinking come true. Wish, wish, wish. No matter what the odds are at this moment or how deep our anxiety is. So, we've been in war since Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's only part of our army. And there's wars going on all over the planet right now. And everyone is tired. And no one knows what's coming. Besides a one world system. If they can pull it off. So that's the end of this one. And that is my analysis of propaganda for the present. The shortwave stations to which I have referred to were Tokyo JVW, Berlin DHE4C, and DJB, Rome 2R04, Moscow RV15 and 11, London GRH, and various American stations. Good night.